Hi, and welcome to Connect Safely Live. I'm your host, Larry Magid. Carrie can't be with us today, but we are honored to have Vint Cerf on board. Vint is widely known as the father of the internet. I'm not going to read his entire bio because that would probably take the whole program. And apologizing for my eyes being off the screen. I don't have a teleprompter. He's a co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the internet, and he's been at MCI, Corporation for National Research. He's currently the chief evangelist and vice president of Google, one of the founders and chairman of the ICANN, which is the organization that assigns domains and all the things like .com, .org, etc. A guy who's just been an amazing person from the very beginning. Vint, great to have you here.
Well, thanks so much, Larry. It's always a pleasure to be on the show. Let me just correct a couple of things. First of all, the actual title at Google is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist.
Chief Internet Evangelist.
Enough people get confused about the evangelism title, and if you call me the Chief Evangelist, it sounds very religious. When that question comes up, of course, I just explain that I'm geek orthodox and that everybody seems to understand that, and we go on from there. The other thing is that I'm not the only father of the internet.
Right.
A lot of people that deserve credit for this long history. It begins in the 1960s, and so it's now 60 years later. Many people have had a role to play in and continue to have a role to play in the evolution of this technology. So very important for everybody to recognize that this was a global and very collaborative development.
Absolutely. I meant to call you one of the fathers of the internet, but certainly somebody who deserves a lot of credit for what's seen. I want to start with something that has maybe something, but maybe nothing to do with your background in the internet, which is something you went through that we all think about today, which was you were one of the relatively early people diagnosed with COVID-19. And as your Wikipedia page says, you're 77 years old, a few years older than I, not many, which puts you at a higher risk, yet here you are. Let's talk a little bit just about your experience.
Well, first of all, the good news is that I managed to come out of it, as far as we can tell, without any serious side effects. Second, the symptoms that I experienced were very mild compared to many that we still read about today. In fact, in some ways, I think the stress of not knowing what was going to happen was worse than the symptoms that I actually experienced. I had a fever and I had a headache and I had chills, which were pretty severe. My wife was also tested positive. I didn't have any of those symptoms at all. So we got off very lightly in terms of the actual impact, immediate impact on our health. It did take about 3 or 4 weeks in order to get back to normal energy levels, though. It was a very debilitating disease. And of course, as you and your listeners know, we're still learning about the nature of this particular disease, how it propagates, how rapidly it propagates, what side effects there are. We really don't know much about any immunity that's conferred by having had the disease. We don't know whether you can catch it again. We don't have a vaccine yet. We don't have any treatments for it, really. So despite the fact that it is now at least 6 months old, if not longer, we are still learning and must learn more about the way this virus works, the way in which it propagates, and the way in which it causes damage to our bodies. So everybody should be very, very concerned about this. They should be wearing masks. They should be distancing. They should be cautious about exposing themselves or others to this virus until we have a vaccine that we can rely on.
You know, I came back from CES with all of the symptoms of COVID. I didn't think about it at the time. I couldn't understand why my flu shot had failed me. And my doctor and I had a conversation about whether I should take an antibody test. And we decided that the results of the test would have no bearing on my behavior. We would assume, even if I did have the antibodies, that I was still vulnerable. I know you're treating it that way as well.
That's right. So, Larry, before we get off this topic, why don't we move to looking at the consequences of COVID-19, the social and economic effects, because it also exposes some pretty interesting features about the internet. One of them is that we're doing this online, but so are millions of other people who were not doing video conferencing before the COVID-19 and the shutdowns and the stay-at-home orders came out. So the fact that the internet has been able to sustain a substantial increase in bidirectional video traffic is fairly incredible. I mean,
It's
you have
impressive.
a lot of credit to the internet service providers for the capacity that they built in originally, I think, motivated by streaming video and audio going outbound from content distribution networks, for example. Now we have two-way significant video traffic, and the network has held up
Yeah.
remarkably well. And so that's good news. The other thing, which is not so good news, is that while some of us, perhaps you and I, qualify as being able to work from virtually anywhere we have a laptop and an internet connection, not everyone can say that. And so we're seeing the brittleness and weaknesses and asymmetries in our social and economic fabric, in our daily infrastructure. And some people are really tremendously impacted by the inability to work in close proximity to other people. And so there are many lessons that we can take away from this experience, not least of which, of course, is to do a much better job of recognizing and responding to the propagation of an airborne disease.
Yeah.
But we also have to understand the nature of our economies and our infrastructure and what we're depending on, and whether or not we can continue to adapt it in order to support people who would otherwise not be able to maintain their normal livelihoods.
You know, from the comfort of my house and the glass door between my house and the outside, I always thank delivery people for risking their lives to bring me food and essential items. And I think about all of those people. I heard a siren the other day. I don't know why, but I thought about that person, that EMT or firefighter, whoever it was, that was risking his or her life to respond to an emergency for one of my fellow citizens.
We owe a lot to our fellow citizens.
That's right. Well, switching gears back to the internet, let's start with your expectations. I mean, I don't know exactly when it was in the 60s, the exact year. I should know this, when you basically launched what is now the internet. But what were you thinking? What were your expectations at the time?
The classic question number 100 is, what were you thinking?
Right.
Well, look, we don't have time, of course, to recount a 60-year history. But the origins of the internet start in the early 1960s. The notion of packet switching becomes noticed by three different people completely independently, one in the UK and two here in the United States. And in the late 1960s, the Defense Department, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, decided that it wanted to build a computer network to allow researchers in computer science and artificial intelligence to share computing resources, because they couldn't buy a new computer for every computer science department that was doing research on CS and AI. And so they said, we're going to build a network and you can share. And of course, everybody hated that idea, but they built the network anyway. It was called ARPANET. And I participated in that effort along with a number of other people. The success of the ARPANET for its purpose, which was resource sharing, also exposed some new applications, one of which was called electronic mail, which arrived somewhere around 1971. Mm-hmm. Just to give your listeners a sense for how long that particular application has been around. File transfer and remote access to time-shared machines was also a very popular application and necessary for the purposes for which ARPANET was built. Bob Kahn participated in the ARPANET design and then went to ARPA. And upon his arrival in October of '72 or so, he began thinking about the possibility of multiple packet switch networks, some of which worked by mobile radio, some of which worked by satellite, some of which worked the way the ARPANET did with dedicated telephone lines, for the purposes of supporting command and control, which meant voice, video, and data from his point of view. But the problem was that these packet switch networks were not identical. They had different characteristics. And so by the time I was up at Stanford, joining the faculty, also around late '72, he came out following spring and said, we have these different kinds of network ideas. How do we connect them together in a uniform way? That was the internet problem.
Right.
And we solved that over a course of about 6 months to develop a set of protocols to allow disparate computers and disparate networks to be interconnected in a way that looked very uniform. And of course, that is the whole idea behind the internet.
Is it true, the story I've heard many times, that the internet was deliberately decentralized to prevent a single attack like the Soviets or others bombing out the central servers?
Well, first of all, ARPANET was not. It was a resource sharing thing. Internet reflected a piece of work by Paul Barron back in 1962 at RAND Corporation, an 11-volume series called On Distributed Communications, which was specifically aimed at maintaining a voice command and control system post-nuclear attack. Mm-hmm. He digitized the voice and he invented the notion of message block, which you and I would recognize as packet switching. So the internet, from my point of view, and I ran the program at ARPA from 1976 to 1982, I wanted it to be resilient enough to withstand a nuclear attack. Now, my best friend Steve Crocker and I have debated about this, and he correctly points out that we never actually did any tests that would be serious enough to demonstrate resilience in the face of such a disastrous impact. But I did do some experimental tests where we fragmented the ARPANET and then put it back together again using airborne packet radios to demonstrate that the protocols could be used to reconnect an otherwise fragmented system. Yeah. So I went a little ways in that, but that wasn't the primary purpose. The primary purpose was to show that we could use the internet to connect disparate packet switch networks and computers of varying kinds in order to be useful in a very distributed and global way. And of course, the World Wide Web comes along in late 1991. It emerges as Netscape Communications in 94 or so, and the company goes public in 1995, and the stock goes through the roof, and the dot boom is on. And now, of course, here it's 2020, and we're now seeing all kinds of other applications and side effects.
And that brings me to my next question. So you obviously predate me by more than a decade, but I was a relatively early user of what the internet slightly before it became commercialized, and of course, very much since then. And I think it was in 1983, which I wrote a book, I think it was published in 84, called The Electronic Link. And I recently wrote a column apologizing to any of my readers who are still around for having failed to do a very good job warning my readers about security, privacy, and all of the things that we're now dealing with. I had not even one word about foreign interference in our elections. It didn't occur to me. And I'm curious sort of what occurred to you during the relatively early times and where we are today.
Well, first of all, during the early phases of Internet's design, I actually was working with the National Security Agency to look at how we could use cryptography in order to protect the system. And about that same time in the mid-1970s, two of my colleagues at Stanford, Whit Diffie and Marty Hellman, developed what was called public key cryptography in a paper they published in 1976 called New Directions in Cryptography. At the time, I was in the Defense Department running the Internet program in 1976. And they didn't supply an algorithm, they simply supplied a concept, so I couldn't implement anything. And around 1978, if I remember right, the RSA algorithms become available, maybe it's 79. But by that time, I was trying to freeze the protocol spec and get it implemented so we could actually test this thing and see whether we could make it work. Mm-hmm. So cryptography as a tool, especially public key cryptography, was not built into the system to begin with, but it's been retrofitted over time. So there are lots of places where we use public key crypto for key distribution and then symmetric keys for more high volume protection. And it shows up in various layers in the architecture as well. It's not just one place. So that's one thing that was, at least the concepts were around. We built hooks into the architecture where we could put some of these security measures. But what I think is very important to recognize is that not all the vulnerabilities and security problems are solvable by pure technology. Some of them depend very much on our trust of people and their ability to remember their passwords or to use two-factor authentication in a regular way in order to protect against various vulnerabilities. And that is a people problem more than it is a technical problem.
Well, I wasn't planning on asking you this, but since you brought up cryptography, I want to talk about modern day encryption. I remember when you had to be pretty geeky to understand how to use cryptography. I remember PGP, pretty good privacy. Well, it might have been pretty good, but it was pretty complicated. And today, of course, it's embedded in devices, and Facebook is going to pull it across the board. They already have it. And as a former member of the board of directors of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, even though I was a proponent of cryptography, many of my colleagues were petrified by it. and we're still hearing concerns by law enforcement. So what's your take on cryptography, on encryption versus the ability of law enforcement to deal with all the various crimes that they've got to investigate?
So it's an easy argument to make, but the wrong one, to say, well, we should build in backdoors or we should have weak cryptography. We already have been through that loop once. You'll remember, I'm sure, that the original data encryption standard had only something like 57 bits of cryptographic key, although it looked like 64. And the original proposal had 128 bits. And although I'm not going to speculate about all of the reasons, it was clear that by the time the National Institutes for Standards and Technology adopted the data encryption standard at 57 bits of key, that there were other parties who believed that they could break that, but they might not be able to break a 64-bit and certainly not a 128-bit key. Well, today, and many, many years later, we have triple DES and we have the AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, and we're now in the middle of doing post-quantum stuff. So first observation is that cryptography is very important, very valuable for protecting you and others. If we didn't have it, you would be much more exposed to a variety of vulnerabilities, which would be really harmful. Getting access to your accounts, getting access to your financial information, maybe your healthcare information or other things that you prefer to keep private. So I'm a strong fan of cryptography and strong authentication. So if you'll permit, I'd like to veer off in the authentication direction for just a moment because crypto is important to it. I believe in anonymity and its value, especially for people who might be deeply harmed if they were exposed saying things, that some repressive regime doesn't want them to say. So anonymity is very important. Whistleblowing is important. But the other side of that, on the other end of the spectrum, is the ability to protect your own authenticity. You don't want someone else to pretend to be you and to take actions on your behalf that you didn't authorize. So strong authentication, which involves cryptography, is actually a way of protecting yourself from that particular risk. And so in a sense, we can see value in both ends of the spectrum. And I'm a proponent of having both of those capabilities available. So cryptography is our friend here. Now, when the law enforcement people complain that cryptography is too strong and therefore they can't see what's going on, it's true that the cryptography may inhibit some ability to see what's going on. So then the question is, well, what should we do about that? And the answer is not weak cryptography and backdoors. I think the answer is good police work. Sometimes it's infiltration. Sometimes it's going after the organizations that hold the data, that might have the data in unencrypted form. We get demands all the time at Google from various government agencies, not just in the US, but in the rest of the world, for access to information about some of our users. We publish a transparency report about that on a regular basis, so people can know how much demand is there and from where are those demands coming from. But it's my belief that the headlines, which talk about all the various vulnerabilities and breaches which have occurred, also tell us about cracking various gangs and other kinds of illegal and criminal activity, despite the fact that strong cryptography might have been used. Some of your listeners will know about the Onion router system, the Tor system. Mm-hmm. And I remember one of the guys who was involved in the Silk Road business, which was basically selling really bad stuff over the net, maybe using Bitcoin as the medium of transaction, messed up his configuration sufficiently that the IP address of his location, or which could reveal his location, was exposed to law enforcement, and they found this guy, running his illegal operations out of a library, I think, on the West Coast somewhere. Yeah. So I don't mean to trivialize the complaint that the law enforcement people make, but I believe good law enforcement practices do not require us to break cryptography or to weaken it.
Well, I'm glad you raised the issue of how it protects us. I reminded my former colleagues on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children board that cryptography also protects children. It protects their anonymity, it protects their disclosure of the location. So we always have to look at the double-edged sword, the nuances. And speaking about nuances, as somebody who has worked closely with folks at Google and Facebook and other companies, you often hear people complain, oh my gosh, we have too much information on the net and it's causing X, Y, and Z, or we have too much censorship on the net and it's restricting this and that. And there's all of these debates. And one of the things that I've noticed is work in advising some of these companies is that the balances are often nuanced. It's not only, well, what's going to make our company more profitable. I'm not saying that might not be part of the equation, but there are issues of competing rights. I mean, you have the right, for example, the right for freedom of the press versus the right of privacy and anonymity. And I'm curious about your thoughts. And this, of course, is very much in the news today as we struggle around, all of the services having to figure out how to deal with hate speech, how to deal with speech from even the President of the United States, which could be conceived as hate or misinformation. How do you protect freedom of speech, but at the same time, protect us from all the harms as a result of it?
So it's a really hard problem. And I have this sort of a syllogism of mechanisms that I generally invoke when we try to struggle with these problems. So the first one is that if in fact there's a technical way of inhibiting the harm, that's very advantageous because you can build it into the system and have it inhibit exposure. So for example, cryptography can be a way of protecting people's privacy, as you say, or protecting their safety and security. And so technical means to inhibit things. Another example that we get a lot of video coming up on YouTube, 400 hours a minute is uploaded. We try very hard to detect things that should not be on YouTube, whether it's child pornography or other kinds of hate speech and other kinds of incendiary materials. Does not belong on our platform. And we use artificial intelligence and machine learning as a way of trying to detect that while it's coming in before it actually gets into the system and can be propagated. So we use as many tools as we can in order to detect things like that. But that doesn't always work. It does not always work. And sometimes it'll make mistakes. Sometimes it'll have a false positive, for example, and that makes people pretty angry because something they put up that was innocuous has been labeled as harmful. And so we try to sort all that out. There's a second response that you can make to these problems, and that's called post hoc enforcement. By this, I simply mean that you tell people that if we catch you doing this, then there will be consequences. And of course, that's never perfect either. I think a lot of us have probably not been caught speeding when we could have been, but nobody was there to detect it. And so we know that the post hoc enforcement is not perfect, but at least it puts people on notice. Mm-hmm. And then there's a third thing you can do, and it's called moral suasion. You just tell people don't do that because it's wrong. And that sounds wimpy, except that you should remember that the weakest force in the universe is gravity. But if you have a large mass like the sun, it holds the planets in their orbits. So when you have a large mass of people adopting particular practices and norms, that can be quite powerful in corralling and let's say, inhibiting some of the worst behaviors that people can exhibit. And now, in spite of all three of those things, there are still going to be people who do bad things on the net. That's human nature. That's why we still read Shakespeare 400 years after he wrote the plays, because he exhibits all of the bad behaviors that humans are capable of doing. And so we simply have to be prepared for the fact that people are human, and some of them are going to misbehave. And we have to do something about that. Now, one last point about dealing with content on the net, which is potentially harmful. I would argue that wetware up here is also at our disposal if we choose to use it. And I call that critical thinking. When you encounter information, you should ask questions. Where did it come from? Is there corroborating evidence? Is there some motive in mind in getting this stuff up on the net? Am I being convinced of something that I don't want to be convinced of? That's hard work, and it's the essence of the scientific method. And yet we should train people early on to adopt critical thinking as a normal practice so that they can protect themselves from misinformation and disinformation.
No, I agree. In fact, in 1997, I gave a speech where I said, I think for the first time, that the most important technology in helping protect children is the software between their ears, as opposed to the filter that may or may not be running on their device. So, but you know, getting back quickly to this whole issue of the harms on the net, some of it is policy related. Now, I can remember personally another apology where I kind of believed everything goes, that it didn't matter how vile it was because you could, you know, accepting things like child pornography, because you could have counter speech to bad speech. But I've evolved, as have companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter, towards more of a nuanced approach to this and saying, yes, certain things in addition to child porn don't belong on the platforms. These are not, the First Amendment doesn't apply to private companies. Companies have a right, just like if somebody on our show were spewing obscenities, we would kick them off the show. Companies have a right to kick people off their platform, but they were reluctant to do so and are still reluctant to do so. And I don't know if you get involved in the policy discussions at Google, but how do you make those decisions between these competing rights?
Well, first of all, as a private company, we offer our products and services with a lengthy collection of terms and conditions, and we do that advisedly so that we have grounds, if we have grounds to terminate someone's account, we can point to those terms and conditions. If we back up for just a second and think of this in societal terms, if you think about the what's called the social contract, you remember that famous 18th century piece. The idea here is that we accept some bounds on our behavior in exchange for a society that we want to live in. And so, you know, my freedom of expression sort of stops, you know, a centimeter from your nose. I'm not allowed to punch your nose. That doesn't stop people from punching each other, by the way, and that's why we have rules about it. But this notion that we want a society that has guidelines and guardrails in order to make it a livable society, I think is a very reasonable concept. And that applies to my company and many others as well in this online space. So taking steps to constrain the bad behaviors where that's possible, or to tell people if we, you know, catch you, eventually your freedom to use our platform for those behaviors will be constrained or terminated, seems like a proper step in some sense to maintain a society that we all want to live in.
Yeah.
And so, like you, I've evolved. You know, it was an easy mantra to say that the solution to bad information is more information. But like you, I think I've evolved to the point where there are some pieces of information that we don't have a need to share in our society, that is not helpful and useful. Now, the other side of the coin, which you mentioned, of course, is if you go too far, you're in a repressive society where you're trying to prevent people from what you and I might call legitimate expression. So censorship is not our friend in that regard.
Right. Yeah, no, sir. And you know, it's interesting, your analogy about the punching the nose. I would argue that if you want to smoke cigarettes, you know, in your backyard, fine with me. If you want to walk around your house without a mask, of course, you have a right to do, and it's safe. But if you get in my face, when my nose, I don't want your secondhand smoke, and I don't want your COVID-19 or even the possibility of it.
That's exactly right. And you do not have the freedom to inflict harm on others. That is simply, should be part of what I think a reasonable 21st society should be.
Yeah. So, Vint, you have been a very active advocate for digital inclusion, and not just in the United States. You and I have actually spent time together on several continents. I remember we were together in Kenya at the Internet Governance Forum, and there are a lot of issues. I mean, the world, you know, even though most Americans are online and probably most people in advanced countries, there are still billions of people who are not connected right now. And there are still some even in our own country who aren't connected. Let's talk about inclusion and what we can do about that.
Well, I really appreciate your bringing this up. I've been involved with several nonprofit organizations that are very much oriented around the idea of digital inclusion. One of them is called the Marconi Society, which I chair, that honors Guglielmo Marconi, who invented radio or discovered it way back in the late 19th century. And of course, that's blossomed into the things that we carry around in our pockets and purses, mobile phones and laptops with Wi-Fi and the like. That organization has begun a major program in digital inclusion for precisely the reasons that you mentioned, that not everyone has the freedom to access the internet. And we know that it has enormous potential, positive potential. We talked about some of the harmful things. We haven't talked about the unbelievable value that the internet has brought in terms of information sharing, information discovery, new business development, new jobs, and the like. So we're very interested in that at the Marconi Society. At the People-Centered Internet, which is another organization that I helped to found and chaired for a while, there's a big focus of attention on digital inclusion, specifically for Native American populations, which have been isolated from almost everything, including the internet. There's work going on there, the Tribal Digital Village down in San Diego, the leadership there, Matt Rantanen and others have been working on this. And then there's the Network Startup Resource Center, which is at the University of Oregon. It's run by Steve Hooter. And they have spent the last 30 years, mostly south of the equator, teaching people how to build and operate pieces of internet, bringing equipment, leaving it behind, leaving documentation behind, and not leaving until they're pretty confident that the people who've been trained can actually build, operate, and expand the network in the countries where they are sited. And that's just three. I mean, there are lots of other organizations that are focused on this. So I'm glad that you brought that up. The term digital inclusion should be understood to be not just connectivity to the network, but a deeper understanding of how to use it, how to be safe using it, how to be effective and successful using it, building applications on top of it, building businesses to take advantage of it. That's what digital inclusion should mean. And to the extent that we are increasingly dependent on technologies like this, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed some weaknesses in our dependence on these technologies. It's also exposed some weakness in our dependence on being able to work together in close proximity, which we can't do now safely without, masks and other kinds of artifacts. So we have to learn now how dependent we are on these technologies, how fragile they might be, how dependent they are on other infrastructure like power generation and distribution, and how important it is for us to know how to use these things. And so digital inclusion includes wetware up here and knowledge about how to apply the technology.
Yeah, and it's very important that people at every level, NGOs, government, think about this, and also do think about the education that goes around it. One of the things that I think about as somebody who's been involved with internet safety since the 90s is how can other countries avoid the mistakes that we've made? Not only in terms of being, in some cases, too permissive, but in many cases, looking at the wrong risks, being overly restrictive, worrying about things that were very unlikely and failing to focus on the things that were likely. We have to wrap up fairly soon, but I do want to think about, on getting back to the question of the evolution. When you started the internet, you were linking mainframes and maybe mini computers, and then later we were linking personal computers, and then the Palm Pilot came around, and now we've got phones and doorbells and the computers embedded in our cars and the internet. And I remember the term ubiquitous computing from the 90s. It was sort of a pipe dream, but it's here. And it strikes me that has huge implications from a policy standpoint, beyond the technology, but from a social and policy standpoint.
So two things seem to be relevant here. You've heard the term Internet of Things, and recently I've been thinking about a subset of them called the Internet of Medical Things, partly because the pandemic has caused us to have remote consultations with our doctors. And I'm sitting here saying, this is very unsatisfying. He's not getting any information about my physical condition. He can look at me and we can talk. But, you didn't get blood pressure and temperature and, all the other things that you should be interested in order to evaluate my physical health. And so I'm thinking about remote diagnosis and devices that we might have at home, or at least on our person, that would assist in a remote consult. And so I think the Internet of Medical Things is coming. Yeah.
This is an internet-connected blood pressure cuff, right? And there are many of those on the market, and they're cheap now, actually.
And this, think about Fitbit and the things that we do to keep track of how well our health and our exercise programs are affecting us. So the thing that I want to emphasize, though, is that all of those kinds of devices are simply computers with software in them. and the ability to communicate on the internet. And that is the thing that should cause us the most concern. This is software which we are relying on to function correctly. We hand it autonomy to operate whatever it is, the device it is that it's animating, so to speak. And it's very likely that that software has bugs in it. And the reason for that is embarrassingly simple. Over the past 80 years, when computers have been around, we haven't learned how to write software that has no bugs.
Right.
And so we find ourselves constantly having to fix the bugs. And of course, then we have to have a mechanism for distributing the fixes. We have to rely on people to do updates in order to make sure the bug fixes are in there. And then we have to have a maintenance philosophy and self-sustaining capacity to keep maintaining the software that those bugs keep showing up. So I'm much more worried right now about buggy software than anything else. And I've challenged the academic community to develop frameworks for software development that will help us expose the stupid mistakes which most bugs start out with, just dumb mistakes in programming, like referring to a variable that never got set, or setting a loop that's off by one, or reading in information into a buffer that's too small. I mean, these are all classic stupid mistakes. And I'm pretty sure most programmers probably have a little dent in their forehead from the frequent times when they slap their foreheads saying, how could I do such a stupid thing?
It's funny you say this. I'm thinking about this in terms of COVID-19. So you're absolutely right. And even a company like Microsoft can put out a version of Windows, or Apple can put out a version of iOS, despite all of its resources and all of its beta testing. And then when millions of people start banging on it, we discover bugs that they didn't know were there, right? That's why there's always a revision shortly after a major launch of an OS. COVID-19, we're trying to create a vaccine in record time. We're hoping to have therapeutics in record time. We don't even know much about this yet. And there are going to be a lot of, it is itself a bug, but there could be bugs in the cure.
This is a scary thought. However, let me argue that we have technology now, some of which is, computational X for some value of X, computational biology, computational microbiology, computational astronomy. We have tools now that we never had before. I've heard reports, for example, of a small molecule study that looked at hundreds of millions of small molecules to see whether or not they might interfere with the progress of COVID-19, the fabrication of additional viruses in an invaded cell and the like. And this system, using AI methods, isolated something, a small number, like 19 or something, small molecules that might actually interfere with reproduction and distribution of the virus out of hundreds of millions of possibilities. So that's the good news. You're still exactly right, though, that in the end, we have to make certain that when we use these vaccines, that they are effective and not harmful.
Yeah.
And that requires clinical testing with real people and great care, of course, to make sure that if there's a harmful effect, that we do something about it as soon as it's detected.
And unlike a computer bug, it's much more difficult to do an over-the-air update if you've had a bad vaccine.
Right. Yes.
I think about that. Because I like to live on the leading edge, but hopefully not the bleeding edge. I drive a Tesla Model 3. Yeah. When you were talking about bugs, I mean, there are bugs in that. There are always going to be bugs, some of which could be life-threatening if under some conditions. And it's very important that we get software right and we get medications right.
So Larry, I think in an earlier conversation I had with some people at BBC, an observation like this was made. And I thought it was important to point out that we should not reject something because it's not perfect.
Yep.
And so perfection is the enemy of the good, or the better is the enemy of the good. What that means is that we should accept that there will be some risk. We should do everything we can to mitigate those risks. But the value of some of these software artifacts is extremely high. And the fact that they aren't absolutely perfect should not be an argument against their use. And I'm afraid some people, for example, a self-driving car, you could say, well, there are a series of scenarios when it might not be able to behave safely. And the real question is, what are we comparing it to?
Right.
Perfection, or to the crappy way human beings drive cars?
Exactly.
And
Head of Toyota Research gave a speech at CES where he said, we accept the reality that a certain number of people die every year in car accidents in human-driven cars, but we will not accept the possibility that even anyone will die as a result of computers making mistakes, even if it's thousands less and die as a result of the human drivers.
So our metric should be, is it better than it was before, not is it perfect?
And I live in Silicon Valley, where the Waymo cars, which of course are owned by the parent company of Google, are driving all over the place. And so far, so good, as far as I know, pretty much.
There have been a few accidents. Most of them, if I remember right, were kind of rear-ender things. And as far as I know, I don't believe anyone has been harmed by any of the Waymo cars. Some people complain that they're too cautious. They don't like getting behind one because it's like a 90-year-old or something.
Right.
But I'd rather have caution, frankly, than sort of an unbridled exuberance.
Well, yesterday I was out. I'm not doing a lot of driving, but I was out testing the newest software update on my Tesla, which allows me to essentially drive on city streets and have it stop at stop signs and red lights. And they've now made it so if you have the autopilot fully engaged, you cannot exceed the speed limit. And boy, did that get a lot of people angry behind me.
There you go. Right. You're going too slow. No, I'm not.
Well, Vint, we're starting to run out of time. Is there any kind of last thoughts that you want to leave us with before we have to say goodbye?
Yes, I would. I don't have time to catalog all this, but Google has been very, very active in protecting children online.
Yes.
There are just enormous numbers of different things that we've done, whether it's applications or YouTube for kids or other kinds of training programs, or even sponsoring other organizations working with the detection of CSAM and the like.
Yeah.
So I just wanted your listeners to know that we're alert to the need to work hard on that problem too. And
I should acknowledge and disclose that Google has been a great sponsor of ConnectSafely. They do support our Safer Internet Day activities, and they are part of what's in addition to our other sponsors, why we can do this webcast. So, and we pay very close attention to what they do, advise them when they develop the Family Link program and some of the other projects that they've done. So we are pleased to see that Google and Facebook and many of these other companies are working very hard to try to protect children, and it's always going to be a moving target. You've been at this longer than I have, and I know you've given many speeches over the years around internet safety for children, and the threats evolve a little bit, but they also always have to do, as you mentioned earlier, with critical thinking, with having that wetware well-tuned, and I might add parenting is a factor.
Also true. And for parents confronted with technology that they aren't comfortable with, they need all the help they can get. Sometimes the kids know more about it than they do, which is a conundrum from time to time. But I'm so glad that you brought this up. And I'm also very happy that we're supporting your operation.
Well, we're very pleased. Vint Cerf, as we mentioned, one of the fathers of the internet and the internet evangelist for Google. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks a bunch. Take care, Larry.
Thank you.
See you on the net.
Yep.